Okay, so, and actually before I even introduce David, we've actually spoken about Nightwatch in this meetup once before, but I look back and it's actually been 4 years since Nightwatch was discussed. So we were still meeting back in the Dunkin' Donuts back in those days. So it's interesting to see how it has come forward through all this time. So a little bit about David. David's been involved in software testing for 17 years. Wow, David, you are old. You know that, man?
Don't feel it though.
He's wise. He's very wise.
He's very wise, like an old owl. He started at Ultimate Software 9 years ago as a software test engineer and has later transitioned into management. His current role is he is the manager of system testing and tools. That's a centralized team that helps other teams achieve their quality goals. So without any further ado, David.
Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah, so Nightwatch.js, so it's going to be a great introduction for you tonight. What is it? It's very similar to Selenium. So that's been kind of the go-to winner of all web automation for several years now. But very recently, a lot of newer kind of frameworks have emerged, a lot of them based on Node.js. I would consider Nightwatch in the top 3. It's right now, at the moment, it's my personal favorite, but you may have heard of things like Cypress, as well as Test Cafe. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but I'm going to show you everything that Nightwatch has to offer and let you kind of go from there, make a decision based on that. So let's get started. Yeah, so as Phil mentioned, David Mello, manager of system testing and tools, breaker of things, and meme enthusiast. And why are we here tonight? So as I was saying, there's a lot of UI automation tools out there beyond Selenium. And today we're going to learn about Nightwatch.js, and basically so that you can compare it to other frameworks that you might already be aware of, learn what it does well, and see if it might be a good fit for your next automation project. No one tool does it all, and the more knowledge you have about the universe of tools out there, the more informed of a decision you can make and pick the best one. So why do I like it? I'm finding with this framework, I can write maintainable and reliable end-to-end tests. And why is that? A lot of frameworks have learned over the years what are good patterns, and Nightwatch has incorporated the majority of them. Some of the big ones, for me especially, is the page object model, along with dynamic weights. If you're not familiar with the page object model, what that allows you to do is put all of the locators that make sense for your pages under test in one central class per page. This way, if you need to make a change to the UI later down the road, you don't need to go hunt down and make individual changes everywhere. You just make that change in one central location and it updates all your tests, so it's a lot less maintenance in the long run. Dynamic weights are important because, especially with web apps, you're dealing with dynamic wait times with either asynchronous content, or your page might run slower some days than others, and then your tests end up being flaky and unreliable. So in the past, what do people do? They end up hard coding sleeps and waits and things like that. And what are those? Those are very expensive, and that's a fixed time. You're always paying, not necessarily for any one particular reason, because let's say you were to code a like a hard 10-minute or a 10-second sleep or something like that, you're paying that 10-second penalty every time you run your test, whereas maybe some days it only takes 5 seconds, some days 6 seconds. So with a dynamic wait, it will wait intelligently, like on a polling basis, until it's safe to proceed, and that will take just the bare minimum amount of time. The other good thing is that it uses the W3C WebDriver API. This is a standard API that all the major browsers, such as Chrome, Safari, and Firefox, went with the W3C implementation. So there's a standard way to control all these browsers. So you should not get this kind of like Wild West implementations. You write your test in Chrome and then it doesn't work in Firefox, stuff like that. So you should get an even playing field with your cross-browser support here. I'm a big fan of Node.js, so that's what Nightwatch is written in. But why I prefer it over something like Test Cafe is like, hey, you're writing in Node.js, whereas Nightwatch, it's like you're in Node.js, but you don't need to be a JavaScript expert necessarily and be familiar with things like async patterns and awaits and things like that. Some of that's just kind of in the background for you, so you can focus on writing your tests. Every framework you're going to run into is not going to do everything you need. So is it extensible? That's a good thing for a framework to be. And you can do that with Nightwatch. You can write custom commands, which we'll get into later. Has a lot of flexibility for the output reporting, which can be very important depending on what kind of CIs you're using in your organization, as well as far as your cloud providing testing services. It can work with things like Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, and one of the cool things that we're going to explore here is the Appium support, so that we can use these tests that we write in Nightwatch to go like through our whole suite of products, so that we don't have to switch frameworks. Potentially, it's something we're going to have to explore, but since it does support mobile, we could potentially write our mobile tests and then go into our web page as well, and just make sure everything is tested under the same suite. All right, so let's get a little bit more into the WebDriver implementation. So you can see how the communication works. It's kind of like REST calls. So it's going to make a post basically to this intermediate Gecko driver, which then talks to the browser, tells it what to do, which then comes back through the communication chain and back to Nightwatch. So it's kind of neat. It's just like any other kind of web service. And like I said, it's got a W3C implementation, so we're working with standards here. One of the neat things that I like about Node is that it has the npm package manager, which is just magical and lets you just quickly bring down any kind of dependencies for your project and installations of things. It's just really simple to get up and running with Nightwatch. It's really just as simple as installing Nightwatch. This -g command just puts it globally on your system, and then you can just install whatever drivers you want to use. So if you want to just control Chrome, you can stop there at Chrome driver, and then you're done. Simple as that. Test project configuration is pretty easy to understand. It is a standard JSON text file where you have things like your source folders for your tests, which can take an array here. And so normally it's just under a folder called test, but again, it's flexible. Your page objects would end up in whatever directory you specify there. If you have any kind of global logic, you can store that in a globals path. So that's that globals.js file here. And then just some wiring here for your actual web driver. So this is just the location on your machine where your Chrome driver would get installed by default if you're using npm. So pretty easy. And then for your standard test settings, you can tell the run what to use by default. So in this case, this will just use Chrome. Here's what it would look like in your file system. So we have our page objects folder, and this would be if we had a page object for the Google homepage, we could put that in a file called Google.js. Your test would be under the test folder. Some of the naming conventions I've seen have just said that just use a capital G in this case for the page object, and then you can call the test like just lowercase Google or whatever is kind of making sense for what you're testing. Your standard git ignore file, there's where your globals file would be in your configuration, and everything else is just kind of nodey. Here's a basic test. So speaking of Google, so here's a simple test that would open the Google homepage, navigate to it, assert that the title is Google, make sure that the search bar is visible, sets Nightwatch in the search bar, hits the enter key, and then verifies that on the next page in the body of your web page, it has the Nightwatch search result, and then it ends the test. So pretty easy to follow. I like this chain call kind of syntax here. We're using a page object here. That's what this Google reference is. So you just go from navigate, you can do your assertions, your value sets, and then you end. So very fluent style if you've ever heard that before. So again, with the assertion syntax, you can do a couple different ways depending on how you prefer. That's the assert style up at the top here, where you can say browser.assert and something like contains text, and then you give it the ID of your control and then the text that you'd assert against, for example. And then there's also the expect, which is the BDD style of writing your assertions, which kind of is like a little bit more English-y, if you will. So that's, you would just change that a little bit to browser expect, and then you would say, you know, this is my element, and then I would say that the text to equal Nightwatch. And it has all these different words that are just kind of like ignored, but helps with the readability of your test. So you can add things, you can just keep chaining things like to, be, bin, is, that, which, and so on. But if you're to do something like that, really just these keywords in red, sorry, just the keywords in blue are what actually get run and everything else is ignored. Global logic. A lot of people familiar with Selenium or other kinds of frameworks or NUnit or JUnit or anything like that are familiar with like before all, after all, also known as like test hooks. You can do the same thing in Nightwatch. It's very similar keywords. You have your before and after. And this I put in the globals file. So in this case, I don't need to worry about actually starting the Chrome driver, which is what's going to launch the browser as well, or shut it down at the end of my tests, like individually in each one of my test files. This is just done once when I kick off a run. So I just start my Chrome driver and then I stop it when I'm done with all of my tests. So nice and keeps things nice and tidy. Here's a little bit more in depth on the page objects that we were talking about for Google. The page objects itself have a special property called URL, and you can give that the URL of the page under test. So in this case, Google, and that is what makes that .navigate call work. When you call .navigate, it's going to navigate to the URL value that you specify here. Elements would be the collection of your page object selectors. So there's a couple different ways of doing that in Nightwatch. This is the longhand version where you can specify the name that you'll be accessing it under. So in this case, search bar, and you can specify a selector. In this case, I'm using a CSS selector. And then you can specify the locate strategy, in this case, CSS selector. But if you can specify what the default selector is in your project at a global level. So by default, that's CSS selector, but you can use XPath if you prefer. But if you go with the default, you don't need to do this longhand version. You can just simplify it to just the property name and the selector. And of all the frameworks I've seen so far, that's the most shorthand way of doing it, which is a big time saver because you waste a lot of time initially setting up these page objects, but then it saves you a lot of time in the back half. But the less time you spend creating things like this, the less you want to rip your hair out. So I enjoy that. As far as using the page objects, use the @ symbol in your tests. So when Nightwatch sees this @ search bar, it knows to look in the page object to go find the locator. So it just does a replace with the locate. In this case, it would be the CSS selector. All over the place. So this is just, again, an example of what I was talking about at the top of the presentation. Imagine if you had a giant CSS selector here hard-coded, and then a developer comes and changes the web page behind you. You'd have to change that in 3 places versus just once in your page object if that ever were to happen. Waiting. So this is what I was talking about before. Nightwatch gives you a few different ways of handling waits. You can use .pause, which is great for just kind of debugging. And in some cases where you can't intelligently figure out like a condition to wait on, you can maybe set like a ½ a second wait, for example. But I tend to always challenge myself to figure out if I can do it on a dynamic basis. So the dynamic ones would be something like wait for element visible or wait for an element present. So if you're, in general, I'd say Nightwatch is pretty good about waiting for the DOM to be ready, but sometimes there might be like an async call that comes in and loads the back half of, or the bottom half of a web page or something like that. That'll tie things up, and you can wait for maybe something in that section to appear visible or be present, which would allow your test to pause the sufficient amount of time and only that amount of time. So it's a very efficient way of doing that in your test. Retries, this can be very good as well. Hopefully you don't need those in your tests, but sometimes, just say, hey, we're testing things on the internet. Things don't always work the same every day. So you can set that on a global basis to do your retry assertion timeout in your globals.js file. Or what I like is, since I like to use this very sparingly, is you can use these .before and .afters chained onto the back of your assertion to wait for, like for example, if maybe the text is blank on a field before an async call comes in, maybe it takes a little bit longer than normal before I get something back from the database over the microservice call. I can say like, after a certain amount of time or before a certain amount of time expires, I expect something to happen or something to be equal. That's where that would come in. Custom commands. So this is a cool one I've used at Ultimate. And what happens if you dirty your database? How do you roll that back and forth? So one of our teams in one of our 48 hours it's like an idea contest that we have to help solve problems among the company, create an ability to create snapshots of the database and then let you restore them over an API. So I can call that using this create snapshot logic that I've wired into the before and after of my tests. So I just create this, I save the state before I mess with it. And then after the test is done, I restore it by using those calls. So you would put the custom commands inside the custom commands path in that Nightwatch.js file. And you would save that in the directory you wired it to. And this is as simple as it gets. You just go ahead and export a class named whatever you want, and then you use this command structure here. And in this case, again, this is just this instant cloud refresh application. So I'm making a post call to it and then wait for no errors to come back. And then I know I'm ready to proceed. So that's just a very simple example of a custom command. So that's an example of a global one. You can also put them in your page objects directly. What those are useful for is making your test more readable and cutting down on logic that gets used over and over and over again. So it helps with the maintainability of your test. So this is an example here in front of you for login. It's something we do on every test, and I don't want to have to copy and paste that logic all over the place. So I have that specified just in here in login commands. Created a function called login as. And that's basically, you just need to return the browser object back so that you can continue chaining your logic. But instead of having to call navigate and set to the username and password and then click on login everywhere, I can have just this one function that handles it for me. So down here you can see I can just say browser.page.login would be my page object. And then I would call that custom command I've just created in that object. So login as, and here's my username and password. You can also add custom assertions. One of the things that you sometimes find yourself in a kind of quandary about is, let's say you're testing something on your web page, but there's no visible indication in the front end that something worked. Maybe the only way of figuring that out would be by checking the database, right? Web frameworks don't usually have a built-in way of using database assertions, but I was able to write something using the MS SQL adapter in Node.js and bring that into Nightwatch. So I've put that on NPM, but I have these assertions, for example, record count is. So here we have some functionality where we hire an employee, and then I make sure that in this particular table, an employee with that social security number now has a row and only one row. So there's not necessarily anything in this case in the UI to know that without having to maybe do a lot of extra automation to get to that screen, which would make your suite take a lot longer overall. So if you're trying to keep your tests very short and to the point, and sometimes you can just go straight to the database to do your assertions rather than having to go all around the UI to get to something. Custom assertions, very similar to everything else. You just specify in the Nightwatch custom assertions path in that Nightwatch.js file. Here's an example. Again, if you use an NPM package, you can just specify the folder of where that package gets installed to. So here's an example of that MS SQL assertions package under node modules. So it's pretty cool. Headless. I'm not sure if everyone's aware of headless mode, but now what you can do is launch your automation tests without launching the browser itself. No browser UI is launched. You have to worry about anything like popping up in front of your screen while you're trying to get other things done. It's good for running things that don't actually have a GUI. So if you're running these tests inside a Docker container, this is gold. And then depending who you ask, this could actually run your tests 2 to 15 times faster. Again, it's going to depend on how CSS heavy your pages are and things like that. So your mileage may vary. The only downside is it might not always simulate realistic user load. It might go too fast. It might not run all the transitions. So not for everyone, but in most cases, yes. And there's 2 different ways to do that. You can specify it in your master test settings, or in the command line, you can pass the headless argument. Tagging, another great feature. If you have a very large test project and you tag your tests using this functionality here, you can specify what, you can sort of break the test up into parts of functionality or something like that. Maybe these tests test our payroll, or maybe these tests we only want to run in regression. So you can tag them using this tags decorator at the top of the suite. And then in using the tag argument, you can specify one or more of those tags to run just those tests. So you can have custom runs without having to like reconfigure all of your tests or break them out like logically and things like that. So file system, I should say. You can also use that to skip tests. So instead of tag, use skip tags in that case. Disabling tests, you can use @disabled_true, similar to the tagging functionality that I just showed you. And if you wanted to just temporarily disable like a specific test, you can just add these double quotes to the front of the test. It's not officially supported. They even say that in the Nightwatch documentation, but it works. Launch URL. So we covered that earlier, and the launch URL is what will be used for your tests on startup, so it knows what to where to navigate to. You can access these in your tests using this sort of syntax here. Using everything kind of floats around in Nightwatch either under this API or browser object, and then it's under launch URL. That's useful, for example, when I was writing the login macro. I needed to know, or login command, I need to know what the launch URL was without having to hard code it into my test file. Here's some other examples of globals. So you can put things like your database, credentials if you want, into your Nightwatch JSON file, and then you can access those elsewhere in your test using that same like API.globals. And whatever the property name is. So maybe it's parameterized test data, maybe it's anything you want basically. But if you want to access something globally from your test without storing it in the test itself, that's how you would do it. So real world use, it was just in a presentation by Angie Jones, who's very respected in the testing community. She's been through a lot of these different frameworks. And she says, when you're about to pick a new framework, use your hardest test case scenario first, because that hello world might look really great, but then when you're invested and now you're trying to actually use it for work or something more difficult, it falls apart, and then you've wasted all that time betting on the wrong horse. So in Ultimate Software, I've been using this for some very difficult portions of the UI, and it's worked actually really well. The biggest problem, as I note here, has been where the DOM is ready, but there might be some sort of animation spinner that's disabling parts of the screen, and that will cause element not ready exceptions. But I actually just recently found the right pairing of wait for element visible with the right control ID to get around that. So now it's running nice and stable. If your application is very heavy with launching new windows or changing frames or frames within frames within frames, Nightwatch is a little bit cumbersome dealing with that. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So to switch to, like in this case, we have a wizard here that when you click the add button, it launches a new pop-up window where you then can do other functionality. But to get to there, you have to call like API and go to window handles and then guess the right window handle value to switch context to. And it's not pretty, but it works reliably, so not too bad. Here's an example where on our main page, you have a content frame, and then inside the content frame is a dashboard frame nested inside that. And then to come back out of there once I'm done, I have to call frame parent twice. So it's like a lot of work. I'm like trying to find things wrong, and this is as best I could find. So these aren't like deal breakers for me. It's just not awesome. So let me show you some real world example. I wrote this very, very simple calculator application in Node just for simplicity's sake. It takes uses three drop downs, takes numbers 0 through 5, and you can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and gives you the result, right? So you should always see that result. And we have some weird fun things there, right? So if you wanted to test this, you could have a lot of combinatorial tests. So it's a good example for something like that. Let me show you kind of how you might approach that in Nightwatch. I've broken it into kind of 3 phases of refactoring. Let me also bring over a terminal. Okay, so I wanted to run the suite that we have on the screen. Do so. And runs very fast, but we're just talking about 2 tests here. So let's just pick it apart, right? So first off, you notice when I ran the test, I used the tags functionality, right? So this is bad, and you'll see why in a second. But we have a standard test called hello world here. It just takes a string in the front, and all the tests you're always passing in the browser object. And then since I am using the browser object, I have access to this URL keyword, which I'm feeding the localhost of the web page. And I'm just simply asserting that the title is Really Mellow Calculator. That's pretty much it. Does everyone kind of with me so far on that? Does that kind of make sense? Not a lot of craziness going on so far.
Yep, looks good.
Cool. All right. And then we get into a slightly more complicated test where we have 2 + 2 is 4. Okay. Again, we're calling URL. We're setting the value for numList1, which is this guy. So numList1. So of our 3 controls, they all have IDs, so that it's pretty easy to find. So numList1, operator list, and numList2, and we have obviously this input button here for submitting the form, and then the result value, right? So for numList1, we're setting the number 2. For operator list, we're setting the addition symbol, and for numList2, we're also setting 2. We're clicking submit, and we're expecting that the result element text is equal to 4. Cool, but we are not using the page object, and you may also notice that we're duplicating logic already as far as calling the URL all over the place, right? So let's start to use some of the Nightwatch features to refactor things a little bit. So this one's called better. So in this one, before each test, I'm going to create a calc page object, and I'm going to call navigate. And as I was saying, navigate is essentially calling that URL value. So it's going to go to the web page for me. So it's basically refreshing the web page, resetting the state so that I don't need to call that in each test. So obviously, if don't need to do that, in this test, I've already reduced half the complexity. And in this one, I don't need to duplicate code. So in this test, it's just asserting that the title is what I hope it is. And in this test, I have now refactored the calculator page into the calculator object here, right? So I can just say calc page.setValue, and now instead of calling the fixed IDs of these controls, I'm using this @ symbol to access the page object. So let's poke over and see what the page object looks like. So down here, we have our URL value. We've got our controls identified with their selectors, and then some additional ones for some of the other examples I was doing, and then our result and submit. So it's as simple as that. Cool. So now we've got some tests going. So let's look at calc test 3. Now, the big problem with testing something like this exhaustively is that you've got 5 inputs times, like 5 operators times another 5 inputs, right? So that's a lot of tests to write. So you want to do it as cleanly as possible if you were to exhaustively do it at the UI, if you couldn't do it at a lower level, right? So here again, we're in this refactored form, we're keeping the same navigate logic on the before each. We've added a page that's a new test here that makes sure that when you start up the page, it's not remembering the previous state or something like that, right? So again, the result should be emptied out. We're expecting all our controls to be zeroed out, and that the default operator should be the addition symbol, so that it's not so like yucky to look at, right? We're doing like set value, set value, set value, click, and you're trying to show this off to someone else that's maybe not as appreciative of the innards of a test framework. I've used some commands here to make things look a little bit nicer. So I've created a custom command called add, so that it's a little bit more easy to follow what this test is doing, and a little less code to write as well. So instead of calling those 2 set values and setting the operator to plus, I'm just calling add and giving it 2 values, and then I'm expecting that results text is equal to 4. So I think we can all agree that's a little bit easier to read, and especially if you're doing this for hundreds of test cases, it's a lot less code to write and maintain. Here's another example of, you can go a little bit farther and use chain calls to make this even more readable, but it's completely up to you whether or not you think maybe this hides maybe even too much of the magic of what's going on in the test, where you're not quite sure what's being tested on the web page, but it's certainly very readable. So, adding 5 plus 5 equals 10. Pretty easy to follow, at least as you're reading the test. If we look at the calculator page, we can look at the functions that make this possible. I have a function called equals, where that's just basically doing the back half of the calc test 2 assertion, right? Where we're just clicking submit and then expecting that the result's equal to the expected value. And then we have some of the more like sugary things like adding and plus and things like that. But we're trying to keep the code as clean as possible, and then we're just duplicating things just so that they have nice readable names. Similarly, I wrote like a very simple app that just has endpoints that listen to various REST calls and will and remove records as needed. In the background, I have a Docker container running SQL, and then I'm just I seed it with some data for Jane and John Doe. And so here's an example of where I'm asserting database records. So I'm not actually even necessarily asserting things in the UI here. I'm asserting things in the database, but you can mix them together as needed. So here's just some just sanity checks, right? That my seeded data is in there. So I'm expecting that there's one record for Jane Doe, one record for John Doe. I'm expecting that 3 people exist overall. And then here's a fantastic test for verifying John Wick exists in the database. So I have 3 URLs, one for adding a reference to John Wick, one for removing, and then the where clause for finding John Wick. So the browser is going to first go in here and assert that the record count in the database is 0 for the John Wick where clause, right? I'm going to go to that URL for adding add person John/Wick, right? And then I'm going to assert that the body of the web page says added John Wick. And I'm going to go there twice more, and I'm going to verify that now I have 3 people in my database called John Wick. I'm going to call the URL that's supposed to clear out all the John Wicks, and again verify that remove John Wick appears on the web page, and then check that the record count for John Wick is now 0, but that Jane and John Doe are still kicking around in there. So here's an example of that. It was as simple as bringing down the node MS SQL driver, combining that with Nightwatch assertions, and it was good to use this. Now, one that's very relevant, legislation and stuff like that, is accessibility testing. A lot of frameworks now have compatibility with the Axe testing framework, which is going to give you a lot of the web content accessibility guidelines assertions for free, and we do have one that plugs into Nightwatch. I didn't like the one that came with. Well, Nightwatch doesn't have one officially, but there's been some people that have developed in the past. But some things I didn't like about the one that was kicking out there was not maintained beyond the core Axe library itself, and it would stop on the first failure, so it would hide all the other problems on your web page. If the first control was inaccessible, you wouldn't know about the 110 down either. So you'd fix one and then be like whack-a-mole. So I modified what was out there so that it gives you a very verbose report of everything that's wrong per the web content accessibility guidelines, and gives you a nice output. So here's how you would use that. Here's a test that goes to on the w3.org webpage. They actually have an example of an accessible homepage, as well as there's one that's inaccessible, and you can run your tests against both. So in this case, all you have to do is inject the Axe framework library, and then tell it to run in what element to run it against. So if you want to do it on just the main body element, it will scan all the controls under body and give you an output. Under rules, you can tell it which of the Axe rules to ignore if you don't want to run it against all of them. So some of these rules are very difficult and may also give false positives. So some things you need to just verify by eye. So things like contrast and things like that, maybe you don't want to scan and just always have your suite read, or maybe you know it's wrong. You file a defect and you just don't want it failing the suite all the time. So maybe you'll file a defect, but ignore it in here, and then just make sure that nothing else kind of pops up behind your back while you work to remediate those other issues that you're already aware of. So let me go ahead and run those tests. So I'm going to run the accessible scan first. And here is what I'm talking about with my kind of verbose output here. So it tells you, because the other thing that the other framework wasn't doing is it wasn't telling you what it was checking. Like if it passed, it was just like, oh, it's fine. And it didn't let you know what was checked. And I was like, that's making me a little bit not confident that it actually did anything. So tell me what DOM elements you actually hit here. So here's all the rules that were run. So, things like hidden body, color contrast, duplicate IDs, empty headings, and then it tells me how many elements it ran these against. So that's really nice to have. And if we wanted to see what failing looks like, I can run this against the inaccessible version of the web page. And then here we get a nice output of all the things that are wrong that you can independently verify and then maybe file some defects against. So we start off with some passes, and then we're learning things like this AX rule for the alt text for images. Images must have alternate text. There was not one for this particular image identified as such. And then again, it gives you the entire laundry list as opposed to just stopping on the first failure and then exiting your test suite. So you have a nice list to work through with your developers. Those are the big things. So I want to leave some time for questions. What does everyone what does everyone think? What features did you like? What didn't you like? Any similarities to other frameworks or any other questions?
Hey, David, is there an equivalent of the Selenium grid for this?
It does work with Selenium Grid.
Nice. Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
David, can you show us what the reporting looked like?
So you got some stuff like this. By default, it dumps it into the test output directory. So here's our various runs. This is just a JUnit XML format. So here's some more with some Meteor test cases on it.
Yeah, I think you're asking for like feedback. It looked really clean. I'm not as up to speed in the JavaScript side, but I do a little bit, and it looks pretty easy to follow. I like the built-in page object model stuff. It looks good. Can you?
Yeah.
Does it support like debugging line by line and brackets if you're like debugging a test and you have all those method calls?
There's actually a YouTuber that has a lot of good tutorials that went into debugging and was able to get it wired in through some interplay between the IDE and developer tools. So okay. Yes, it's just been like months since I've done it.
Yeah, no worries. Just curious in general.
Yeah,
like,
so it's possible. It's possible.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but given its similarities to Selenium, I mean, I'm not an expert in either. But what made you choose Nightwatch over just maybe Selenium directly? Was there anything that made like really stood out between the two?
Mostly because Selenium, you're basically just getting like a raw automation framework, and a lot of these things like page objects and dynamic weights and things like that, at least historically, are not just freebies. You have to kind of do it yourself, and it's a little bit more cumbersome to use.
Sure.
And I just kind of prefer this just out of the box. It works. And there's different flavors obviously for Selenium as well, but a lot of people use it for Java, which I think is very like heavy for depending on what you're doing and if you're already using Java in your projects. Mm-hmm. But there's also node implementations of the Selenium driver. But what I found with that is it's worked great for, like, I've used the Selenium node driver for things like web page scraping and things like that. But for like hooking with assertions and stuff like that, it's not as awesome. So I don't think I can say anything bad about any of the frameworks. It's just this is a little bit better. So that's why.
Cool. Very cool.
But yeah, that being said, like I mentioned earlier, obviously there is Selenium. As far as like some of the more modern frameworks, if you haven't checked out Cypress, that's definitely worth checking out, as well as Test Cafe. Some people like PyTest as well. I haven't played with that one enough, but obviously if you've got a lot of Python developers, that might be interesting. A lot of the JavaScript ones are obviously very popular considering how often Java is used nowadays. So it's easy to find someone with those qualifications typically. See what are other good things. What I didn't like about Cypress initially was the lack of cross-browser support, but I do hear that is a thing it does support now. It does give you a little bit of a more friendly UI, like it launches some things in the browser where you can kind of step through the features a little bit more cleanly. But it's a slightly different framework. So like I said, check them all out, but I just wanted to show people here tonight what you can do with Nightwatch, because it's expensive with your time to kind of do all this from scratch to learn about new frameworks. So I figured this would be helpful to kind of like put that out there for people so they know that this is in the universe as well. And then, you can go on with more learning and check out other frameworks as well.
Very cool.
Cool. All right. We will wrap it here. We really thanks everyone for spending their evening with us. We do like to do these in person and feed everyone, but given the state of the world, you know, I think this wasn't too bad. So thank you very much for virtually attending this evening, and hope to see you again in a future one. Philip, do you have any parting words for the group tonight?
I do. Before we let you go, David, we recorded this evening, and David is going to post this on his YouTube channel. So do you want to let everyone know where to look for you?
Yeah. If you want to see these live examples, they're on my GitHub. The official Nightwatch Getting Started is on their webpage. That's one of the really good things. They have a great Getting Started and API and docs reference. So that was really easy to follow when I was learning about this. I have a blog, davidmiller.com. You can check out. My YouTube is black all of a sudden, but it's my YouTube link is the /c/reallymellow, and you can also follow me if you'd like on Twitter @reallymellow.
Very cool. Thank you for an awesome presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it, everyone.
And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We will continue to try and do these meetings from time to time until we can all get back together in person. And of course, to add to the fun this year, we've got a storm brewing out in the Atlantic that we're going to have to worry about for this weekend. So anyways, stay safe, and we'll see you the next time we see you. Thank you all. Night.
Take care, guys.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye.